Well, hi guys, it's Ian at SS8000 Cars and we're in London. However, we're in London in a 540c McLaren, and I'm going to chat a little bit about how I'm getting on with the car. It's really giving me a good idea of the experience of living with the Sports Series McLarens. Now, there are three models in the Sports Series. There's the 570S, the 570 GT, which is a slightly softened version of the 570S with effectively a glass window at the back that you can open, so it's effectively a hatch. And I don't think there's much more room in the 570 GT than there is in the 570 or the 540, but ultimately it's easier to put your stuff in the back than pulling the chairs forward and trying to get your bags through between the chairs and the bulkhead. Okay, so we're gonna get on going and I'll chat through how I've been getting on with the car over the last couple of weeks. Firstly, I need to put my seatbelt on. Everything down here is very simple. I tend to run it in the softest of settings when I'm in town and in auto mode, but occasionally if I need to be able to put it in the powertrain and the handling positions that I want, by pressing the active button on the center console, it immediately changes the car into sports mode. I've got it set for manual, and I've got the handling set up for, sorry, I've got the powertrain set up for sports. But however, when you're pootling around at 2 miles an hour and everybody else is doing the same, really changing manually is a little bit of a waste of time, so I shall take that off. Okay, and we're just about ready to go. Take it nice and gently. I think we'll turn the car because we're actually in the wrong place. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're on our way. Now, the first thing to say about this is you can never get away from the fact that it's low slung. The seats are set fairly close to the ground. You know, if you're ever behind an SUV in this, you know you're behind an SUV in this. But outside that, the 540 seems to have an even more compliant suspension than the 570 GT I drove back in October, November of last year. I think it was November. And as a consequence of that, I find this car very, very pleasant to drive. Firstly, the twin clutch, double clutch auto box is really, really easy on you when you're in handling normal and powertrain normal. Very, very easy to use, and it changes fairly early, so you're not worrying about using excessive revs the whole time or holding on to gears longer than you need to. It seems to just about have everything set up in the way that I like for driving round town. I mean, as I think I've said before, I do spend quite a lot of time in London, and this is the second time this week, and it was 3 times last week. So I really want something that when you're in traffic, it does everything for you to an extent, with the ability, as I said, to push the active dynamic panel down here, and that immediately sets it up the way you want. One of the things I love about this car is the race mode or the track mode in the powertrain, where the rev counter changes into exactly the same rev counter as you'd get if you were racing this in the GT4 series, which you're obviously aware they do. But you have to have it in manual mode, because if you don't have it in manual mode, you'll find that it holds on to all its gears, so you hardly ever get out of first in London. It'd be a little bit annoying. Now, the other thing about this car that I really do like is I like the suspension setup. You know, the suspension setup is really nice. It's gentle. In normal, for handling, it's gentle. It's almost no body roll, even in the normal setting. It's really comfortable and really relaxed to drive, and I think I said even more so than the 570 GT, which was originally sold on the basis that it was the comfortable McLaren. I think the 540C is even better in that respect. And I mean, let's be honest with you, there's a difference between the 570 and the 540 is in the name. It's 30 horsepower effectively, and for ordinary driving you just wouldn't notice. You would not notice the extra 30 HP. I suspect you'd be hard pressed to notice it even on the track. So as an everyday car, if you're contemplating using this as your main mode of transport, then I have to say the 540C may make a better option than the 570S. Now, I'm going to reserve judgment just for the moment until such time as I've actually driven the 570S. As you know, I've driven the 570 GT, but I'd like to see how stiff the suspension is in the 570S. See, the 570S is probably the best buy in the range, because although it's £20,000 more expensive than the 540C, which comes in at 126.5, I think, thousand, the 570S is about 146.5. So 20k, but 8k at least of that is taken up with the fact that the 570S has standard ceramic discs. Now, this 570 GT didn't, so the list price on the 570 GT I think is a little bit more, just into the 150s, and you've got to pay to have carbon ceramics on each corner. So, you know, if the 570S was still usable in London, then I personally would give that serious consideration if I was looking for a sports series everyday car. And although McLaren call this their sports series, really both the 570 and the 540 have enormous reserves of power. I had a friend's GT3 RS out a couple of Sundays ago, and I loved that car. I mean, do you know, that probably is right up there for me with the 675 LT, if only it had a touch more power. Not that when you're in it you ever feel like it's lacking power. The engine screams up to almost 9,000 revs, and you know, the GT3 RS is a hugely involving experience in every single sense of the word. Now, this is quite more sophisticated than that. It's not a race only car, it's very much a use everyday car. But if you look at the figures from 0 to 124, so that's 0 to 200 kilometers, this is half a second faster than the GT3 RS. The 540 is half a second faster than the GT3 RS. So it's worth bearing in mind when you tend to think of the McLaren baby, you tend to think in terms of, well, obviously it's a bit slower. Don't believe any of it. Really, you'd be hard pressed to experience the difference between the 570 and the 540 in everyday use. So that's why I actually think if you don't want ceramics, and really ceramics do two things. Firstly, they provide you longevity, so the brakes last longer, but also that there's less chance of fade with the ceramics. So if you're using it on a track, that's, I guess, important. And of course the ceramics are lighter, so you know, you're bringing down the weight of the you're bringing down the weight of the car. But if you're using the car every day, as I've proved on my GT4 with steel brakes, there's no reason to have ceramics, none whatsoever. And of course, when you do come to change the ceramics, they are horribly expensive. So we stick with steel brakes, I think, unless you're intending to use the car regularly on the track. Now, I've not used this on the track. The GT4 on the track doesn't seem to experience fade because it has the GT3 braking system, even although it's the steel discs, and it's absolutely fine. So I think probably in conclusion, on the braking side, I think the steel discs, if you're going to use this car every day and maybe track it occasionally, are perfectly fine. And for 126,000, you've got a lot of car for your money. Now, I'm not going to try and suggest that it's quiet inside when you're using it. It's perfectly fine in traffic, but obviously when you're motoring on, it's quite vocal, but you don't really get too much road noise through the cabin. Now, one of the things that I get a little bit in the 675 is I get slight vibration in the cabin, which I'd understood was because it was a carbon fibre monocoque, and as a consequence of that, I suppose you'd say, well, this is too, but there's no vibration in it, none whatsoever. Now, this is the carbon monocell 2, so it's slightly lower at the front, and I think we're going to see this chassis actually make an appearance in the replacement for the McLaren 650S, which I think we can say now, because it's everywhere, is going to be called the 720S, which I assume denotes the horsepower, although that's not been confirmed as yet. If the 720S has 720 HP, the performance on that car will be extraordinary. I doubt very much whether something like a LaFerrari or even the 918 would pull that much faster. I suspect they would. I remember watching one of Mr. JWW's videos where he put the 675 against the 918, and there's no question that the 918 was the quicker of the two cars. But 720 in an even lighter car, because apparently the new 720S is going to be lighter than the 650S, not exactly a heavy car. So what the replacement for the 675 LT will be like, you can only begin to imagine. I reckon something like the 750 LT, I reckon it'll be of that ilk. And to an extent, it must make Ferrari and their 488 feel a bit hard done by, because they've only really just produced a car in the 488 that produces 660 HP, or 661 I think, and they've now been usurped by 60 horsepower. Now that's a lot of extra horsepower. Just letting a bicyclist through. Okay, so, you know, I'm really pleased with the car. I would suppose I'd like to end by one of the things that I've always thought that a compliant suspension gives you is the ability to be able to drive these cars in all weather conditions without having your heart in your mouth. Now, I remember when I had a 575, which, as you probably know, was a Ferrari 575, which was a development of the 550. And although I loved the 575, when it rained, your heart was in your mouth. You had to be very careful how you applied the power. Now, in this car, in the 540C, I've had this car for 8 or 9 days when the temperatures have hardly got above zero, and at night they've been down at -5. And I've been getting up or going out at 6 o'clock in the morning to drive to London when you've still got frost on the roads practically, and there could be ice anywhere. And this car is easy to drive, both when it's chucking it down and when the temperatures are well below zero. Now, I think that's an example of a really well sorted car. There was nothing frightening about driving this in the country at 6 o'clock in the morning when it was -4 on the actual dash itself, I think. So I think that's worth taking into consideration. It's another example of how usable this car is on an everyday basis, because you've got 540 HP, the wheels are driven through the rear. You'd expect it to be lively, but it's not. As long as you're in normal on handling and normal on powertrain, you'll be absolutely fine. So if you fancy something like this, go for it, guys. It's it makes a wonderful everyday companion. Okay, well those are just my thoughts for the moment. So it's Ian from SS8000 Cars signing off. Please make sure you subscribe. Cheers.